When I'm ready. Boss is not here.
Okay, watch. That means you gotta watch what you say now. Otherwise, whatever you say that's not, it gets on the website and you're in a manual, that's not what you want. Good morning. See you all. We're moving along in, the New Testament, which is exciting. I always like to start with, a couple announcements. We have a big family retreat this weekend in Tampa. By the way, last Saturday, I don't know if any of you were out at the park for family night, movie night. Were you out there?
No, but Dee sent me pictures.
It was glorious, right? We did that in cooperation, I think, with the police department out there.
And
And
Dee said
were you
the
out there?
sheriff's department was really pleased and planned to do more.
Over 100 people, kids, under the pavilion watching movies, they had, one of those outdoor movie things set up and just, Dee was,
Super Mario Brothers.
yeah. Dee just was thrilled with the results, because you never know about these things. Part of it was you had a lot of police out there, so I think families felt, if you're in the middle of no place, they were safe, and so that was nice. Then this weekend, like I say, it will be a family retreat, so we'll have over 100 people in Tampa. That's always one of my favorite events of the year. That about 70% usually are primarily Spanish speakers, so they come from Jose's bilingual service, and 30% are Anglos. And it's all done in Spanish and English, and it's just a special retreat as well. So I mentioned that because sometimes if you go to 9 o'clock, you go, where are the kids? Well, but we're working on it. We're working. Also, we want to keep the family, the Finks in our prayers. Diane died this morning at 3 a.m. after receiving ashes last night after the service. So the whole family gathered and requested ashes, and there's something about that service, just period. I don't know about you, but when someone looks at you and says, you are dust and dust you will return. But, there are people in the service who, have cancer, who are struggling, and it just hits home. And I think the older we get, it just hits home, it just does. But then when you're, in a hospice situation, in a hospital, for a family who desires that, not every family would desire that, but that's a very powerful thing. So we want to keep their family in prayer this morning. Yeah, and we the Jewish tradition of the Elijah chair.
Yeah.
That you keep one chair, Passover free. We're doing that this morning for Matt. That's gonna be the Matt chair. It's rare to, on Transfiguration Sunday of all Sundays to watch Matt, who was glowing, was kind of transfigured in the back. I don't know if you got a glimpse of him when we said goodbye, but he, if you've seen the pictures, I guess, Roberta, you were the one who took the picture, or Jennifer, or somebody, but you sent them. He's glowing. It was just marvelous to see that, because a lot of people come and go here, and we can't do that for everybody, obviously, but for Matt it was special because he was baptized here. He came to faith here, and we can kind of watch him, especially in this group. We can kind of watch him from being, this Christian beginning out until a couple weeks ago. He's the one who knew all the answers, right? He was doing all the stuff, so that was thrilling. All right, we did 2 weeks on Matthew, now we're moving to Mark. And some of this is a little review, because we want to always compare, but most of it's going to be new. The first gospel written was Mark, okay, even though it's not in the list that way, and there are reasons why those who designed, put together the Bible have Matthew first, but we're not going to discuss that today. So Mark comes first. We also mentioned, the years that it was written. In the commentaries, it says 50 to 70. The key is, I think it's in the 60s, and I'll give you a reason why. But that's important because the temple was destroyed on 70. That's all you have to remember, 70. And this is the only gospel written before the destruction of the temple. So that's important. We also know, like when Matthew wrote his gospel, when Luke wrote his gospel, I only say it this way so that you remember that he's plagiarized, right? Matthew's got Mark in his hand, says, oh, I like the way he wrote that. I think I'll copy all the stories in order that Mark wrote. So and then I'll add to it. So Mark is the first in the genre that we accept the scripture, but he sets the tone and the outline of what's happening. It's really rather remarkable. Now, it's important pre-destruction of the temple, but the best guess of scholars is that Mark was written in response to Nero. Now, we all know, for Christians, Nero is not our favorite Roman emperor. Okay. It would appear that Nero wanted to do some housing projects in Rome, but a lot of people lived on the land where he wanted to do his housing projects. So he came up with a solution. We all know as Rome burned, right? Nero was he was a little crazy, or a lot crazy. But he would not be the first or the last person to clear out space for his building projects through arson. But of course, as he played his fiddle, he was not going to take the blame for that fire. Right. So as always, you have to find a scapegoat. Yeah. And it was Christians. And so a great persecution of Christians broke out with Nero, and he could blame them for, kind of reminds you of Hitler, if you remember, in the lead up to World War II, he sets the fire, and then blames others for it, right? The Jews in this case. Here, the Christians get blamed, and so a great persecution happens. That's in 64. So that's, you don't have to remember this. But I think if you always have to say, why did Mark write this thing? And often isn't that the case if something happens that's dramatic in our lives and we respond to it? And here, many scholars think Mark is responding to the fire. He's responding to Christians now having to deal with persecution. They're having to deal with Nero. So before the tragedy of the temple, but after the fire. And in my mind, that makes a lot of sense. We can't prove it, but it makes a lot of sense. Who is Mark? That's one answer. We've got two answers, and there are scholarly works making distinctions between Mark the evangelist and John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Okay, and oh boy, there's just a lot of literature. In some eras of the church, they're put together as the same person. In other eras of the church, they're separated, and then you have to decide if it's Mark and John Mark, which is the one who wrote the gospel. That's all wonderful literature to read. Any opinions on that? All right, before I get in trouble, I gotta,
Well, wasn't he, didn't he go on Paul's first missionary journey with him, and then there was a big falling out?
Okay, that's John Mark.
Yeah.
Okay, and so if you're interested right now, you can turn to Acts 12:12. We know that John Mark knew Peter well, and if and knew Paul. He knows both. And some will say this book references conversations with both Paul and Peter. So he's an insider, right? He's an insider to the apostolic movement. But if whoever gets to Acts 12:12 first can read that.
When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying.
So this is when Peter's, released from prison, right? So where's the first place he goes? John Mark. So obviously very, very close. This, by the way, I should say, written in 64 Nero, so it's written to the Christians of Rome, possibly from Rome, right? The word of encouragement. So if we are running into texts and stories in Mark that deal with oppression or violence or people trying to figure out, have courage in the face of the scribes and the Pharisees, now we know why. These are stories told to embolden the Christians in Rome. All right, so first gospel written, I think, in 65 to 67. You're just getting my opinion on that. Again, scholars will broaden that out. This is an interesting and easy gospel as far as outline. Remember in Matthew, you know, you've got the introduction, which sets all the themes, and then you've got the 5 teaching sessions that are mixed in with stories, and you got the closer, right? This is so much easier than that. It's a travelogue. It's like when you went to Israel, for those who've done it, you know, and you say, oh, okay, I'll fly in, you know, to Tel Aviv, and then I'm gonna go to Jerusalem. But really, I'll go to Galilee and I'll just work my way down, and then we'll say goodbye in Jerusalem again, and then we'll fly back, right? It's that easy. The whole book starts in Galilee, part 1. Chapters 8 to 10 starts part 2, where now Jesus is gonna move down to Jerusalem. And you're gonna find out what happens in part 2. And in part 3, he's in Jerusalem and killed. It's easy, just Galilee to Jerusalem. All the first part up to chapter 8, Galilee. And then you can feel this transition. In fact, we read a text from the transition, that's transfiguration is part of the transition, verses, or chapters 8 to 10. And then goes to Jerusalem and everything happens. So why? So there's a simplicity, right? But that's not a simplicity we see in any of the other gospels. Like John, Jesus always went up and down and up and down and visit and forth trip, you know, and he's always going from Galilee to Jerusalem, which makes more sense, right? Even when he was a child, went to see the temple, then he goes back because that's what people did, right? That was part of the ritual, the religious celebrations. I mean, big celebration, you go to Jerusalem, you offer sacrifices in the temple. So other gospels, I'm guessing, are probably more true to Jesus's movement. There would have been times he was in Galilee, there's times that he would go to Jerusalem, and then he would return. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. But that's not how Mark wrote the gospel. He simplifies it. All the Galilee stuff happens at the beginning, and then there's a movement, and then there is a closer in Jerusalem. So that's the nice thing about Mark. It just makes everything so simple. Not accurate, but simple. Right in Rome, we said, here's gonna be the kicker today. And that's the short ending. We mentioned that last time. It ends in, and you should turn to that, turn to the end of Mark. It ends, it's got the short ending. We looked at that last week just briefly. Chapter 16, verse 8. Who ends a book this way? Right? I mean, it almost reminds me of, you know, when I was in high school or not college, I think I went to the first time Waiting for Godot, you know, where you just kind of it ends and you go, what just happened? Wait a minute, is it over? Just another intermission, wait a minute. But there was a purpose in Waiting for Godot. The Godot never comes. Here, anyone want to read that? Well, we should probably read all 8 verses. Start with 1 and just read the whole last chapter. Melissa, you have that?
Yeah. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed.
How many angels did they see?
A young man.
How many angels did they see? Of course, this is one of the classics, because you go to the other gospels and there's more angels. And Was there one, is there two, or what? So we get, it's a young man, right? Okay, keep going.
Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Which just goes to prove, I think, that these women were Lutherans.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know on that one.
No, no, no.
I tell you,
Around the
Proto-Lutherans. Why end the book that way?
We're waiting for the sequel.
Okay, say more about that, because this is your field, you know. Why would anyone giving an oral presentation, because this was first given orally, end on such a note?
Stay
Keep
tuned.
you listening and waiting for more. Maybe exploring on your own or waiting for the next class.
Stay tuned more.
From whom? Now, some will interpret it this way. What are you gonna do about it? You now know he is risen, right?
Right.
The angel proclaims, he is
Yeah.
risen, and the women go and they're frightened. They didn't say anything to anyone. How about you? So almost, you can almost see the narrator kind of gesturing, right?
Yeah.
They went away afraid. They, yeah, with the implication, what are you gonna do about it? Are you also gonna be trembling and afraid, knowing what Nero is doing to you now? Or do you stand up and are you courageous? What are you gonna do?
The
Well,
other
because
thing is, they had a mission, they were going to do a certain thing, and now that mission has changed. It didn't fit. It didn't fit at all, you know, so they have to change.
Where's Jesus? Where does the angel say Jesus is?
Galilee.
He went to
Gonna go
Galilee.
He's gone to Galilee. He's waiting for you there. And the women are trying to figure out now, what are we gonna do,
Exactly.
right? So it almost sets you up for a conversation. It's almost like, you know, John Mark here says, okay, now let's all break up into small groups. What are you gonna do about it? Jesus is waiting in Galilee. What are you gonna do? As you can imagine, some of them are going, oh, I just wanna get out of Rome. You know, I just want to, whatever. Some are saying, hey, let's go where Jesus, let's go to Galilee. That's it. Now, they know the end of the story, right? This group. But again, this is just a clever, I would say, a rhetorical device used to motivate. You know, it's like that, one sermon I heard, I can't remember who it was, you know, he gets up and you're expecting a very prominent person and he's read from John's gospel and he gets up and his sermon, you know, lasted, I think, 5 seconds. He said, love one another, and then sat down. And there's just this stuff, you know, just quiet, like, okay, is that it? Am I supposed to think about that? What am I supposed to do with that now? You know, it's just quiet and no one knows what to do. Because you're expecting something different.
And I'm just wondering, because it said, you know, so this young man tells them this thing, this story, really. Do they believe it? I mean, like, what?
Trembling and bewildered. The women went out and fled from the tomb.
And being bewildered, that doesn't know if it's belief or unbelief, it's just the state of flux.
and is it because it was women?
No.
The man.
I think they probably believed them. I mean, they saw enough miracles,
Sure.
you know, over
But
his
it-
life.
Yeah.
That he sees this one, but, you know, I'm sure they wanted some reassurances.
But the man tells the women, go tell the disciples and
Right.
Peter, he said, tell
And
them,
the
right,
disciples and Peter, so
yeah,
Peter gets lifted up here as the
Uh-huh.
leader of the band.
right, and being women, they're gonna tell. Not only them, but they're gonna tell.
Are they?
Yeah, I think so.
Now, if we read the other gospels, like say Luke Acts, what happens? Luke Acts finishes the story. To your
They
point,
told it to the 11 and all the rest.
Right. they did tell.
okay? And,
And they didn't believe them because there were men with them.
I don't believe the woman.
So that- if you take the two stories and put them together, now that's dangerous. That's what
Yeah,
it's dangerous to
yeah.
do. But that was quite a walk back to town. And it seems like it was something very positive that happened, that they're going, wow, the angel's
Mhm.
right.
Had time to think.
We had time to think about it, we had
Right,
time to
right.
process it together. And by the time they get back, we know they're the first witnesses then of the
Exactly.
resurrection. So the whole church is built on their testimonies. And we know the disciples went,
I don't know.
Mhm.
I gotta check this out.
The
Yeah.
fighting.
you know Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother and James and Salome, they're just, pretty spontaneous and emotional and.
Hormonal.
Yeah, right. That's not in the script.
No, it isn't. My
In
version.
one of the ancient manuscripts, right, in the footnotes. So, for whatever reason, but, even in the Jewish tradition, women were not always, valued even as witnesses in court,
Right.
even in court. So, here you've got this tradition, just like the birth of Jesus in Luke Acts, where it's the shepherds who were also not the most trustworthy in the ancient world either. So what does it say about how God functions, Very interesting about
Mhm.
how God kind of flips things on their heads here in the story.
We've done another Bible study that says if you want to know where Jesus is, he always goes low, to the lowest of the low, to
Right.
come on.
But even in the prophets, right, it's the remnant, right? It's never
Mhm.
the scribes and the Pharisees. In fact, when Nicodemus comes to Jesus, it's sort of an exception to the rule. You're not expecting any of the religious leaders to be responsive to faith. So that seems to suggest who that merry band of first Christians were. And it was not up until maybe the 4th century. It was just not the most prominent people in town, Wasn't the mayor was not there.
And the first people to see Jesus birth, the shepherd. Low, talk about low. They went out rejoicing and telling everybody.
And who was healed. I mean, you look at some of the healing
Yeah.
stories, those who were demon possessed, again. I love The Chosen, that was one of the first episodes with Mary Magdalene, and you can see troubled woman, troubled path. And turns her life around. So I think it's a rhetorical device. You could see the narrator kind of up in your face and saying, and they went away bewildered and trembled. Hmm? Then I would add, and what are we gonna do? I think that's the rhetorical device.
The question is, why did he end it this way? It's a frustrating ending, but based on this discussion, it's a brilliant ending too.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, and most commentators would say that now. So it's actually, and remember, this is like theater. This would have been performed, right? Given, not read initially. So yes, it had that force to it, like a good play, of motivating. All of us to act differently than the women who were terrified and bewildered. Now, but you can see why in the early first couple 100 years, people would get this in their church libraries and they go, someone didn't finish this gospel. Somebody, you know, we like happy endings. So if if you like Disney films, you don't like Mark. So you want to add, and, we mentioned last week, I don't want to read it, but it's sort of a charismatic, sort of Pentecostal ending, where snake handlers, I was kind of kidding Matt about
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
he's
yeah,
going to the land, Tennessee, the
Tennessee.
land of the snake handlers. But you can feel the compulsion of those writers adding to the manuscript and saying, you gotta tell people. You gotta give them a better ending.
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, the first hearers knew that he was, the first people to read this knew that Jesus was risen. It wasn't as though that's the end. They know that that's not the end, which of course is why they had another ending.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an analogy of, if you're telling your kids about how, you fell in love. Because kids often want to know, where did I come from, right? And then so you just kind of start, and if you ended the story, well, we got in a fight that night and we both went home.
Well, they-
Wait a minute. How did I got? Well, we woke up and made up and there you go. We got married and they know there's a finishing to the story because they already know the story. So that's why I think the rhetorical brilliance of people who already know the ending here and how you can motivate them by stopping a little early. And they're kind of, you can feel them leaning into the end of the story. And I think that's cool. Okay, before we watch the film, you remember the middle section. Jesus is in Galilee, and at one point in chapter 8, if you turn to that. And many people say this transition begins with Peter's confession of Christ. Up to this point, there's only one group, I can't say of people, there's only one group who knows who Jesus is. Do you remember who that is? The demons.
Oh,
Everybody else is going, I don't know. And the disciples are still trying to figure this out, who's Jesus? We haven't figured this out yet. It's all kind of confusing. Here, Peter comes, and in this middle section, this is part 2, you think finally there's a breakthrough. Oh, finally, Peter's figured it out. But of course, we know Peter still is not the sharpest crayon in the
No,
box. So remember, he says, some say John, who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah. But who do you say that I am? I thought Pat Cervolier hit this last week really nicely in saying, well, okay, you're the Christ, right? You're the Messiah. And Jesus warned them not to tell anybody because he knew they didn't understand. And then, Peter's on the mountaintop, but that's going to get bad here because then Jesus predicted his death. Right? And then Peter goes, no, that's not going to happen to you. And he goes from being the rock of the church to get behind me, Satan, all within a couple verses. So Mark is not going to let us rest in thinking the disciples knew what was going on, who Jesus really was. It's not. And the disciples are clueless from start to finish in the Gospel of Mark. Literally from start to the finish, bewildered, and trembling, they left the tomb. It's that consistent through Mark's Gospel.
I think sometimes it seems to get a glimpse of something that you might confess, but then it's gone and you're back in your old.
This is a great example of that.
Yeah.
It's like Peter's got a glimpse, but he just doesn't really know what he just even said is accurate. And then we have the transfiguration. Where is that, Christian John? Of course, you also have James and John in this section coming to Jesus, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask.
Yeah, right.
I prayed like that, by the way. We laugh at it, then we go, wait a minute, that's my prayer last night, you know? They replied that one of us sit at your right hand, the other your left hand in glory. Why would they ask that? Why is that? Because Jesus is, they still think a political Messiah. He's gonna overthrow the Romans. So they're already thinking ahead to say, you know, I'd like a good cabinet position. Right? And we're in primary season. We see that happening, you know? People are vying to be vice president or cabinet members, or that's what they're doing out there. They're not campaigning really for presidency sometimes. They're wanting to say, you know, look at me for a prominent position later on. That's just what James and John are doing here. Because it's a political case. So again, that's why Jesus constantly says, don't talk to anybody. Because you're just gonna confuse everybody with your confusion about who I am.
Yeah.
So when he does predict his death, of course, you know, Peter just doesn't get it. The Transfiguration is a 9. Again, this is part of this, again, middle section. And once again, the disciples say, it's good, Lord, to be here. I really like the sermon that said, but I've got to go to the cross. We can't stay here on this mountain. I got work to do, actually important salvific work to do. So I read those because we skipped, by doing the Bible study here, getting a whole vision of Mark, you can see that we're skipping around Mark. Right? We skipped in the narrative from John the Baptist, right? At the beginning, we talked about last time, he starts with John the Baptist, Jesus' ministry. Jesus just kind of appears. And Mark, Jesus isn't born. We don't have Mary and Joseph. We don't have any going to Egypt. We don't have any of that. Jesus just appears, is baptized, begins his ministry. That was 2 weeks ago. And then we skipped all the way to chapter 9 this week with the Transfiguration. We're doing a little disservice here to Mark. So you know we're gonna have to then go back to chapters 2, 3, 4, 5 in the future. We're gonna have to go back to recover because we skipped too much of the book in those first couple weeks. Does that make sense?
I have a question. I had to go back and look because I didn't read the first one. If Matthew's gospel, talking about the wanting to be on the right and the left hand, says that was their mother's request.
Yeah.
I didn't just look that up.
The mother urged them to do it.
Do it, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty
Kind of like
interesting.
Rachel.
Yeah,
And you're not surprised by that.
no.
I think I would have been surprised if they said the father encouraged them to do that. That's not, you know,
Yeah.
Mhm.
at this time, the mothers there's more at stake, I think, for them. You know, there's also even protection for the family. If your children had prominent positions, they could, you know, elevate the whole family. It was one of the only ways you could get ahead, really.
That was the mother's social security. too,
That's right.
you know.
That's interesting. I had noticed that in the past. That's a good catch. All right, are we ready? Okay.
I have to ask about Peter. When did I first recognize that he wasn't the brightest bulb? Why does Jesus always say, tell the disciples and Peter? Somebody and Peter.
And does he always say, now he does that in Mark,
He doesn't mark,
And
but I don't see
for
it.
some, they think that's a clue to the relationship of the writer with Peter. Right, because he's maybe even giving maybe he got that story from Peter.
Oh.
Because Peter told him, you know, then, you know, they said, well, go get disciples and me, you know, he wanted to talk to me about it, you know, of course, because I'm the leader, so he wanted to talk to me. And so, Mark goes, yeah, you're my friend, I'll cite you on that. Where in John's gospel, who's referred to all the time?
John.
So then, is that a clue of who's writing this one? And how does John's gospel refer to John? That's like when your kids get together and they're going, well, you know, mom and dad.
Love you better. His favorite.
Either they love you best or they love me best, you know that, right? Because you're adopted. Or those old things that we do. I think most people say these are clues to the relationship of the writer with some of the people. in the book.
I looked at the Martha video thing with our small group, and that woman claimed that John Mark was the author and he was close to Peter and he was telling Peter's story. He was writing Peter's story. Thought that was kind of an interesting.
Mhm. So that's one of the theories.
Mhm.
But that he would have known Peter and John Mark would have known Peter and Paul as well, because then you're talking about the missionary journey.
Mhm.
So I like that theory too, because then you've got two of the closest disciples to Jesus and you're getting source material from them. And also Peter would have been in Rome, been part of that persecution of Nero. And now you're hearing the Christian community is suffering, we need help. You know, can you do something, that type of thing. So I like that theory and I think many scholars lean there, but some of the older scholars like to divide what they call Mark the Evangelist from this John Mark. So you get to read books and books, or you can just Google it and then you'll have, article on it.
Or you can just say, okay.
All right, let's lean now into the video. Again, think about the simple structure. Think about how it begins with John the Baptist, not with all the birth narratives, not with, Mary and Joseph. We don't have Egypt in this, and then we have the three Galilee to Jerusalem, this very simple development of his outline, how he writes the gospel. By the way, this is a Gentile audience he's writing for, right? If he's writing to Rome, then that's important as well. So you can see why he doesn't need the genealogies. Because in Rome, nobody cares. Is he the son of David? Did he mention that? I don't know, so watch that as the video unfolds.
The Gospel according to Mark is one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus, and our earliest historical traditions link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark. He was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. And in fact, an ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter and then shaped them into this account. But Mark didn't just randomly throw the pieces together. He's carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes this claim about Jesus. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark is going to tell you what he thinks. For the rest of the book, he's going to influence you by simply putting Jesus's actions and words in front of you and showing you how other people react to him. Now, Mark's designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first one set in Galilee, the third one is set in Jerusalem, and the second act shows Jesus on the way from one place to the other. And each of the acts focuses on a repeated theme. So in Act 1, everybody's blown away by Jesus, and they're wondering, who is this Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And then in Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic king. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it unfolds. After the opening line, Mark begins with a quotation from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when God would show up himself to rescue his people and become their king. And Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and then right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. And as he comes onto the scene, the heavens open, God's Spirit descends on Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." After this, Mark places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil and its hold on people's lives, and then by inviting them to live under his reign by following Jesus. From here, Mark's given us a big block of stories showing us Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom. He goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. And Jesus even does something that for Jewish people only God has the right to do. He forgives people's sins. And Jesus' actions here produce lots of different responses. So some people follow him and become his disciples. Other people don't know what to think, and still others reject him completely, especially Israel's leaders who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. But Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. In fact, he draws attention to it. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. And Jesus says that his message is like seed falling on different types of soil. Some are receptive, some are not. Or it's like a mustard seed that's very tiny. It seems insignificant, but then it grows huge and surprises everyone. Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter, this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it. They respond in confusion and fear. And so here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain, and he's suddenly transformed. He's radiating with light and glory, and a cloud envelops them. Now, this is just like the glory of the God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. And then the 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, they appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." Now, by placing this story in the middle of all these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own glory. And in Jesus, the glorious God of Israel is going to become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a puzzling claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. Which brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes a very public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover. People are hailing him as the Messiah. Then he enters into the temple courtyard and he asserts his royal authority by running out the thieves and crooks and stopping the sacrificial system. Then this kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, condemning their hypocrisy, and so they set in motion a plan to have him killed. And Jesus warns his disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation, and his disciples will be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over the world. And it all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with the disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And Jesus takes these symbols and he gives them new meaning. They point to the liberation from sin and death that will happen through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest, his trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, all resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. And it culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes from Acts 1 and 2, except this time it's darkness that descends, not a cloud. And instead of the divine voice from heaven, it's Jesus' voice crying out before he dies. And then most surprising is that it's a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die, who grasps and then announces who Jesus is. This man was the Son of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity, that it's the crucified Son of God who's the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and for his enemies. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, and on the first day of the new week, 2 women from his disciples come to the tomb, and they discover that the tomb is empty, the stone's rolled away, and an angelic man informs them that Jesus isn't here, that he's risen from the dead. And so he orders them to go and tell this good news to the other disciples, that Jesus is alive, that he'll meet them back up in Galilee. And the women, they're freaked out. Mark says that they fled from the tomb in terror, telling no one, for they were afraid. And that's how the book ends, with Jesus' disciples showing the same kind of fear and confusion that concluded Acts 2 and 1. Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll see that the Gospel of Mark has more to its ending, where Jesus appears, he speaks to his disciples, but there's also a note there telling you that that ending is not part of the original book, that it's only found in later, less reliable manuscripts. Now, it's possible that the original ending got lost, or that Mark actually never finished writing his account, but it's more likely that this abrupt ending is intentional to make a point. The entire story has focused on the shocking claim that puzzled Jesus' disciples from beginning to end, that it's the suffering, crucified, and risen Jesus who's the Messiah, the Son of God. That God's love and upside-down kingdom were revealed as Jesus died for the sins of the world. And so this story ends without closure, and it forces you, the reader, to grapple with this very strange and scandalous claim about Jesus. And are you going to run away like the disciples? Or are you going to recognize Jesus as your king and go and tell the good news? And only you can answer that question. And that's what the Gospel of Mark is all about.
Okay. What do you think? What ideas, any insights, anything, stick out in your mind as you?
When did they think those added verses were added?
I'd have to go, see what that says in your book. You have a footnote in your, sometimes it'll mention which for all these books of the Bible, we have various manuscripts at different times. So what they're saying is the oldest manuscripts, which they think are the most reliable, they end with verse 8. Now you have to know when they say that, how many times in the Bible do we have footnotes like this put right there in the text? I can't think of another example, so it's pretty pronounced. And that then they added these, and in some Bibles, they will actually point to which manuscripts are there. Mine doesn't here, this one doesn't.
Mine just says later manuscript.
Yeah.
Add one or both of the following endings. I've got plenty of footnotes on everything. No footnote telling me.
Mine mentions the possibility there was another ending that was lost.
Yeah. And you heard him say that here, I think that's right. But one of the nice things about that footnote is that forces you to say, wait a minute, how do we put the Bible together anyway? Who does that? This note almost forces that question on us, right? How does it, who made the stew? And what's in the stew, and how were decisions made, and what did they use as a standard, right, to make those decisions? Now, I like those questions, but it sort of takes us off the mark here of reading the book. First of all, with a short ending, and now I think I like the explanation we heard here, that it's a rhetorical device meant to inspire us to action rather than a mistake. Because otherwise it's a mistake and we lost the original ending. It could be true.
I mean, ending where they did without the additional stuff was a rhetorical device.
Yes.
So why are we ending it?
That's rhetorical.
It's a rhetorical device. I don't like your rhetorical. So you're here, what am I supposed to say? I just said it. I don't like the think of that. So it doesn't do as much for me. It creates problems. Now I gotta deal with snake handlers, or And I've dealt with stake handlers. I don't mean that literally. I mean that more figuratively, you know, where all of a sudden now God's the God of power. God does miracles if you believe. In fact, you know, if you can't handle a snake and, you know, if you die of poison, that means, you know, you're not a real believer in Jesus, you're being disobedient. And I've been in fellowships like that, you know. And that doesn't at all reflect the rest of the book. The rest of the book isn't talking about those issues. It's the Messiah at the end who has to die. It's almost like the longer ending reflects the misunderstanding of the disciples of who Jesus is. So, you know, even in Mark, you know, even to trust miracles all that much, because that can, you know, take you down the wrong path. So Mark has got some great features, which I think are elevated more with the short ending. But there's just enough doubt that they left the second ending for you to decide where you.
I like the comparison where at the transfiguration, there was glory of God, and then at the crucifixion, darkness. And here at the transfiguration, God saying, "This is my beloved son," and then at the crucifixion, this Gentile saying, "Truly, this is God's son." You know?
To me, I really picked that up this time. If you're writing to the Christians in Rome, and you end your book with finally the person who recognizes who Jesus is as a Roman soldier, that's kind of powerful stuff. That's like Hollywood production.
Where were you disciples? You were hanging out with them.
You know, those people you hate, you know, who are oppressing you, they're the first ones you recognize.
Right. I was just noticing again with John the Baptist. And God is saying, "This is my son." And yet when he's in prison, he goes back to doubting. I mean, you can't get more proof than what you heard with your own ears.
So here it is, John the Baptist, such a great point. He's so strong in that first chapter. He's so weak as the story goes on. And then who comes up strong at the end? A Roman soldier. So that gives you a hint of who's the audience of this book.
What a shame it had to come to that before somebody recognized who he was. I mean, I know it was, he was supposed to do that, he died for us, but it's just a shame that at that last moment, that person recognized that.
So it's interesting again, who recognizes Jesus at the beginning? It's the enemy, the demons. At the end, it's the enemy, the Roman soldier. And in between, even John the Baptist, who gets off on a good foot, he's wavering, you know, he doesn't know. And
Confirmation.
so Mark, I think he's trying to bolster the people in Rome who are also wavering. I mean, they're starting to lose their confidence because they're getting that Nero's just coming after them. You can imagine if you see your friends who are entertainment now in the Colosseum, and they're getting killed, brutally killed for the faith. And then where's God? Has God abandoned us? I mean, you can imagine all the stuff that's happening, you know. And then John Mark comes and says, even our enemies in the end recognize who Jesus. Even they knew, they could see the soldier looking at him on the cross, not doing the miracle stuff, on the cross. And that's where God's glory shone.
But the rhetorical question still is today, people are still saying, where is God now? With all that's happening, famine, genocide, our political situation, the migrants coming in with no place to be, and this is global, not just here, it's global. People are saying, where is he? So we still have those same questions today. I believe myself, but there are a lot of people that don't. They say, where is God? Where is God in all of this? My thought is, he's right here in the midst of everything, where the lowest person is, he's right beside them. That's my thought. But a lot of people don't feel that way.
So, a couple responses to that. Notice when the soldier again recognized who Jesus was on the cross. That is counterintuitive. It's not the soldier who the stone is rolled away and Jesus pops out of the grave and he goes, wow, that's
That's a miracle.
That's a miracle. I believe now, you
Yeah.
know. No. So Marcus he's agreeing sort of with Jesus' Bible study. When Jesus did Bible study in Isaiah, he said, that's me. That's me. You know, the suffering servant. And for a Roman to be the one to recognize that first is quite a statement here in Mark's gospel. It's not like, oh, go to Galilee, Jesus will wait for you, and then you'll believe because you'll see him alive again. I mean, I get that. So how is it that we can see God in suffering? Right? God's presence is not always it's like comes when the darkness is there, to use the language. On the side of for our Lenten devotions this season, we're gonna look at lament. And so I think the first one was sent out last night, but the lament, I'm gonna say, is turning your complaining into prayer. So it raises the question, how do you change your complaints? And we've got them. I mean, you know, listen, where God are you on the border? Where are you in Gaza? Where are you in Ukraine? Where are you in the Sudan? I mean, we can go on and on. Where are you in my own life? And the Bible at least encourages us, in the Psalms in particular, but also Lamentation, how do you turn those complaints into prayer? Because often I think, Catherine, I don't know if you agree, just we often think the problems are so big, my God, I believe, is not big enough to address them. It's all spun out of control.
Or I'm not important enough for God to think of me, because a lot of people will say,
Great.
who
Yeah.
am I? In the Bible, it says, what am I? When I look at the heavens, what am I? I mean, I think that says it too.
Great. So a diminished faith, one way or the other.
Yeah, I was thinking too that, when I think of friends or family, even grandchildren, that either they lost their faith or they're struggling with their faith. I think, gee, if only Christ could be back and walk with us. And yet we're witnessing him, as Ray says, with John the Baptist, who knew him, baptized him, proclaimed him, and has this doubt, where are you? And as Catherine says, you know, we see all these troubles whirling around us, and it's not reassuring, but it just, you see what a struggle it is with ourselves to grasp the whole picture, and then to deal with people that you love dearly and try to share with them why the faith is so important. So I just, a bit of frustration.
I think when you lay that out in the last couple of comments, that is the environment in which Mark is writing, but to the audience in Rome. But we can identify with them. But that's what he's saying in Rome there at the end of the 60s, and he's trying to address it with the book, which is pretty powerful. We want to.
What do you think the Roman officer saw that he thought this truly is God? Because, I mean, you have Jesus saying, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And, you know, I know it adds to it that you have the curtain in the temple torn apart, but a Roman officer can't see that. Or do you think maybe in a day or two after it, he said this, taking everything together? Or what do you think? They don't tell us what he experienced that he said that.
I'm trying to look at the story again to see.
Did they say it was darkness and the earth was trembling, like the earth was really trembling? I mean, that would be something that I would think maybe would get somebody's attention. I don't know.
It did say darkness.
Yeah.
You do have the temple, where does that come for here? The curtain. The Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Do you think somebody was at the temple and came running out and pulled them up, the curtain's gone?
I can't imagine.
But maybe he's.
Maybe he bought out his cell phone and he saw the. Oh, look what's happening in the temple. And as a Roman, I don't care,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's not a Roman type of thing, miracle.
Yeah.
That would have probably mattered, I'm sure.
And, you know, when you think of the triune God, you wonder at a point like that, what was the work of the Holy Spirit? You know, he's not mentioned in the Gospels, not identified as part of the Trinity that calls and enlightens us to true faith. And I'm wondering, this is a thought, could it have been the Holy Spirit?
That's a good thought.
He, again, I'm trying to read this again just to see if there are any hints. He. So, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry, the alien is on the other side, my God. Maybe there was a way he said that.
Or into my hands I commend my
That
spirit.
type of thing, that he
Give
said,
them.
I heard his cry, surely this was, Son of God. Notice he doesn't say Messiah,
No.
Mhm.
But that's gonna-
Son of God.
Yeah.
So he was at least recognizing the relationship. To refer to lament again, here Jesus is lamenting, it's one of the great laments, right? Why have you forsaken me, quoting the Psalm. And there's something in how he cried that it would suggest here that had quite a lasting impression, obviously on the.
Christopher Paul's prophet said the same thing, you know. Would that, I mean, they would believe in God and that they were sent from God. And why have you forsaken me? And God didn't come and save them.
And doesn't hear.
No.
And that wouldn't, I don't see how that would inspire a Roman official to say, oh,
But the whole matter
Literature.
in which he
Yeah.
was, which he died, they can.
Maybe
Crucifixion,
he
he wasn't screaming out and damning the Roman Empire or anything like that. He humbly went to this. He knew this was the goal in life. To
Because
go.
he didn't take the vinegar, he didn't take the
No.
drugs that they were gonna give, you know, which we all do, right? At the end of life, we all take the morphine,
Right.
which is, that's kind of what this was like a morphine.
He said he wouldn't drink wine.
Wouldn't drink it, his call was to suffer. I'm only guessing here that something in his lament at the end, again, he does not strike out as I think most would at the Roman soldiers, the brutality of the crucifixion. It's really at the end only between Jesus and God, his Father. There's something about they're talking and everybody else is there. Observing, yeah, as observers rather than really. We're guessing, but we are cluing in or honing in on that one response to the cry. Right?
This seed might have been planted,
What's that?
seed might have been planted in his mind of doubt, whether he was or not, Christ, until he's there. Obviously, he might have heard about him prior to that moment.
But you can, I'm sure he did, because Jesus caused some problems, but when you think about it, the person who's participating or at least supervising the crucifixion is the one who comes to faith. Ooh, that says a lot about all of us, I think, so.
And this person, so probably seen many people.
Oh, it was probably his job. Yeah, he was on the battalion
Right.
and crucified people.
Here, this guy is different, there's something in.
Exactly.
Something in, I don't know,
Right.
he's different.
Yeah.
I don't think we know how people come to faith. I mean, they have to know about the word, but I don't know how my daughter came to faith, except we talked about it, we lived it, whatever. I don't know how her son came to faith, except he talked about it, but we don't know what perfect little seed made them,
Something says.
willed them to faith. I don't know.
Do you remember he referred to that in the first section, part 1 of Mark? Remember that, the mustard seed, Jesus was starting to, why did someone come to faith and not someone else? There's a mustard seed and then there's, planted on the different, qualities of soil, So Mark is trying to answer that, but with a picture, with a metaphor rather than, oh, it was.
And I like it written out.
Right.
So I can do
Let's break up now into our groups and don't just focus on one thing of Mark. Make sure you move around a little bit. So if you spend a little time you know, with Peter's confession, then move maybe the transfiguration to the ending or other insights. So there's a lot going on here in this small book, 16 chapters only. But try to move the conversation, as far as takeaways from Mark. That, any insights that you, brought up in the group that you just want to share with the larger group?
Well, they were just, there was just a question that we had. What were the ages of the disciples and the people? Were they Jesus' age? Or were?
No, they'd have been teenagers mostly.
Yeah.
I've always seen, you know, we see the pictures of them, we see the stained glass windows and they all got the halos and they're all these guys with, you know, with, you know, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox beards and, no, because they were often not married. So Peter, we know, was married. So when he went to the temple, he had to pay the tax. I don't think you paid the tax if you weren't married.
How old do you think Jesus was when he died?
Usually 33.
What
Yeah.
did AD stand?
Yeah, the year of our Lord.
What does that mean? Age?
After death, AD.
Well, then, mine is
No, not after, no, the age, no, not after the death. It's the age of after birth, really.
It's starting from his birth on.
Birth on. So it was AD is a theological statement. It's now the whole world will be measured according to the birth of its Savior.
Now it's C.
Yeah, which is why some people want to change it because they say, I don't share that, so we'll have common era, right? Trying to neutralize the.
But I think that's a sign of our Christianity falling and falling, you know, in
The change.
the worldview.
So, which is why some of them have bought that, and they'll write AD no matter what.
BC too. Yeah.
But it's the birth. So you don't know, but it's 33. It's usually how old he was, that's what. So he would have died somewhere in that time, 33.
my timeline here says he died in AD 30. Which doesn't make sense to anything, the birth or death.
80-30.
Right.
That would have been using another calendar, so maybe there was a Jewish calendar there that they used.
Okay.
Mhm. But just find out which calendar. But then, you know, you get Constantine, who becomes emperor. And then he, you know, when you're emperor, good to be the emperor, you get to change everything.
Right.
And so you go, oh, we'll have another, you know, and so after that, of course, you got the different calendars, Gregorian calendar, you have a calendar of the east, you have a calendar of the west, and so any emperor can do those things, can change. And, you know, we know that today, you know, my daughter lived in Jerusalem for quite some time, and, you know, first the West would celebrate Easter, and then 2 weeks later, Eastern Orthodox would celebrate Easter, so they'd be celebrating Easter for weeks. With different processions, everybody having, because as we know, we function on 2 different calendars. Any other insights from Mark? Who would say now that Mark is their favorite gospel?
Me.
Come on, don't hold back. Don't be embarrassed.
Oh, beautiful.
Liking it.
What's that?
I thought I heard somebody say that.
Someone online say they like it?
Reminds me of the old Dragnet, you know, just the facts, man.
Although, yes, just the facts, because he, and commentators will say very efficient with his use of language, but he's always then saying immediately.
Yeah.
Immediately, you know, and so you've got, that's also a writing style that says there's movement in the story. He wants to keep going. Here's the thing we don't do, but we should, is there's times you just have to sit down and read the whole gospel as a book, as a book. And I had the benefit of having a professor, in Chicago, a colleague of mine. And he, felt strongly that you had to hear it performed, because that's what would happen at this era, is that someone would memorize this and be in your living room and perform it, because that's the way often this material in oral culture was handed down. And so, he would go into various settings. He'd go into churches, but he'd also go to hospitals. I saw him up in Kenosha once do this at Carthage College, you know, from a boat. Just a little bit out into Lake Michigan, and we were all kind of on the. And each time, each setting makes a bigger difference, because if you're in a hospital and you're hearing the healing story, I'm just telling you, it's like a big deal. Or, you know, when he was out on that boat, we're all imagining how the disciples heard it, and, you know, the water acts like an amplifier to the voice, and so you can hear, the crowd can hear a little bit better. And so each setting, even in a church, as you walk around, took an hour, 1 hour performance apart. That's how long it takes to tell the story. And see it verbally is wonderful, but then, of course, for us, often it is in writing. Some, I know, do this, but it's a great way to do your devotions every once in a while, if you have the time, is get an audio tape. You just listen to Mark, someone tell the story. Again, it can be very powerful when you finally hear the whole sweep of the story. Again, like you read literature in college, or now you read the whole book. You don't buy a whole book and say, oh, you know, I just only like that chapter 10. That one story. Now we do that, right? We do that, but normally it makes more sense to read the whole book.
Mark Bible study, actually was in one where the instructor talked about Mark and his gospel, talking about crucifixion at 9 and death at 3. And that those were the times of the morning temple. And I thought that was really powerful connection, it was correct. And I thought it was really interesting that was the symbolism of it. And I just don't know, and I didn't have the courage to go back to Leviticus, I'm sorry.
Bewildered and trembling there. But it'd be good to look back. My guess is it's accurate. My guess is it's accurate, but I think, was there only 2 times it's accurate?
And Mark's the only one who gives old time.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I was gonna say that I think that I don't have a favorite. I think they all are meant to complement each other. They show in our language today, POV, everybody has a different point of view. But yet they all read the story, and to me, I don't think one is better than the other. I think they all make each other better. Myself.
So here's another last thing, and then we're gonna we'll discuss. When we're hearing a reading in church, let's say like last week on the Transfiguration, I find it helpful to go to the Bible Project and just play the 5-minute tape. And then you go, oh, how does this text for this week fit into the whole story? It's just a reminder, because you know Mark now, but yeah, you forget because you.
Oh,
We're old.
Well, no, we got a lot of material up there. There's too much in the storage. And so it's helpful to remind ourselves, where does the story for this Sunday fit into the larger story? Because it just adds to your whole Sunday experience. Now, when we do that with Mark, of course, that's one thing, but you know, if all of a sudden you see the reading for the week is from Leviticus, well, you need a reminder, because you've got, oh, what was that again? I know it's about sacrifices and all the rules, and so that's why I love the Bible Project for many reasons. But one is you can quickly do a review of a whole book, so that then the Sunday experience, I think, is
question. At the Mount of Transfiguration, why did Elijah and Moses appear? I think you mentioned that, but do you have a theory of that instead of, why those 2 people appeared?
But we heard Pastor Lilliard's, he thought it's just what they needed in just the amount of time.
Oh.
I think, you heard what he said here, these are the two people who had experienced, Mount Sinai. Moses going up for the Ten Commandments, remember Elijah went up there in the whirlwind and then heard Jesus, heard God speak in silence. So both of them had experienced the glory of the mountaintop experience. And now, I think Mark wants to say the new glory is in Jesus, right? So,
And Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and
the
prophecy.
law of the prophets. Those are quick answers, but obviously this is loaded, sort of loaded. He makes it the centerpiece. Good gracious God, we thank you for your blessings. We pray for our own witness that indeed we have heard the witness and the testimony of the experience you resurrected and present and active in our lives. We pray indeed we will be faithful in our witness to you on this day and this week. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Jim, are we praying today?
Immediately
Yeah.
We're gonna be praying.
Luke is next week, right?
Luke, yeah.
Oh, I like it.